All right, one question, Sarah, that's been submitted is during your process of writing the book, weaving history and research and memoir, how did you know what to throw out and what to keep? And can you just tell us a little bit about your process?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about creative nonfiction is that we get to put ourselves in the story. And I'm jealous of your journalism background because I really wish I had more journalistic training. But I really wanted to write about the facts, the issue, the history, and how it impacted me. And you can't do that in certain disciplines, like if I was a PhD in history, I wouldn't be able to put myself into the story. But in creative nonfiction, we can do whatever we want. So that is something I really valued because I feel like it's so important for us as a society to connect those dots, to connect the dots between what the history is and where each of us is living. So I really wanted to kind of offer an example of how to do that. And as far as how I knew what to keep and what to throw out, it was really all about the structure and the structure. The book goes between a historical person and then a chapter where I kind of explore how that historical person makes me think about myself. Um, and that structure came to me in a couple different stages. And the way I remember it is that they were both like middle of the night aha moments. So as I said in the last session, I kind of decided in the summer of 2020, like, I'm just going to listen, pay attention, journal, whatever. So I had this all floating in my head. And I remember kind of a middle of the night moment where I had to get up. So, I sleep in the room right there. And I had to get up and come into this room and write on a piece of paper, like, these are the specific things that I think I need to repent of. Like the one of my goals in writing this book was I want to show people how to repent of specific aspects of white supremacy. And so I had this list of like, oh, it's this, and this. And I wrote these things down. And then it was a couple months later that I found. So in the beginning, it was just, okay, there's this story of Jacob Vanderpool, and then I somehow want to talk about myself. And I actually wrote an essay at first that was just Jacob Vanderpool and me, and it was like going back and forth. But a couple months later, I found the letter that I talk about. I don't know if you've gotten to the chapter about Thomas Nelson, the judge, yet, but I talk about this letter that he wrote to his wife. And when I found that letter, I was like, oh, that was when I realized I have to talk about all these other people. It's not just about Jacob Vanderpool, it's about the white people around him. And then again, it was a middle of the night. Like, I have to get out of bed physically and come in here and write down. I'm going to go back and forth between each of these people in history and each of these things that I've already figured out that I want to write about repenting of. And so it was kind of putting all that together and laying it out in like, these are the 10 chapters and this is the structure. That's when I realized, oh, this is a book. So I didn't know that until I'd done a lot of sort of mental groundwork, done a lot of research, done a lot of soul searching, let it all just kind of clang around in there for a while. And then it sort of emerged. That is not always the way it happens, that your structure just like pops out at you. But that is what happened with this book.
I love the structure stories, and I have some really great structure stories for my own book,
Mm,
both
yeah.
book. And I do think, especially for writers of faith, it's a prayerful sort of participatory, you know, like not that I'm like, dear God, give me my structure, but I'm kind of like, dear God, give me my structure. And it is an unfolding, and it is a very spiritual experience for me. But did it feel spiritual to you?
Totally. Totally. It felt, and at one point, so I have all different kinds of Christian friends who speak to me in different ways. And I have a friend who's very like, you know, not like this is the word from the Lord all the time, but every once in a while, like this is the word from the Lord. And he said to me, God has really enjoyed writing this book with you.
Mm.
And I just really appreciated that. Like, oh, thanks. You know, just that sense of like, yeah, we have been doing this together.
You're welcome, God.
Yeah, me too.
Enjoyment. Beth, do you have any follow-up questions? Sorry, I jumped in there.
I think if you and I could sit down together, I think we would have a fun conversation.
Yeah,
I
let's do
just,
it anytime.
Yeah, I just see a lot of things in your writing that I admire, and I like that interweaving of those two things. It's fascinating to me, and I think I don't know about you, but I could dig and dig and dig down that rabbit hole and never stop. And so that's the problem, is when to quit.
I just saw a meme. It was something about it was for writers of historical fiction, and it was something like I don't remember, but it was something like know when to research and when to stop. And it was like knowing when to stop is huge because yeah, you could keep going forever.
Yeah,
But at
when I
some point you have to
first, I
stop.
mean, I'm 59. So when I first started as a journalist, we didn't have all this internet rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to go interview people and read the actual documents. Now
Mm-hmm. It's
because
endless.
yeah, it's an
Yep.
endless search. But
Yeah.
thank you. And I like the structure as well. I like being led that way through the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, and I didn't keep the timer. So let's ask the second question. If you aren't done answering this next question by 11:30 Central, let's stop at 11:30 to start the next
Okay.
portion of our
Sounds
seminar.
good.
Okay, so this question comes from Susan, and she wants to hear a little bit more about identity and writing and how identity affects the way we show up to the page, decide what to write, and that sort of thing. Is that accurate, Susan? Is that it? Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I loved kind of when Susan, when you were talking about this when we were off recording, when you were talking about your own history of being Armenian and the court case with, you know, is that white or not? And that's so such great evidence of the fact that white is kind of meaningless and made up, and that its boundaries have been adjusted over time. This didn't end up in the book, but one of the things I found when I was researching was this conversation that was captured verbatim of a legislative session that they had in Oregon when they were trying to write the law that only white people could vote. And they were trying to figure out, well, what does white really mean? And they had this whole conversation where they're like, well, is it Irish? Is it not? Is it this? Is it that? And it's just, it's all right there. And they're like, they're making jokes about it. And it's like, I think sometimes we think that it's more scientific than it really is. I mean, it really is just made up. And so I think your story is a fascinating one to explore that question. Like, what does white even mean? And I mean, I don't think that only Armenians would read it because it's something that we're all trying to figure out. What does this mean? How did this come to be? And where do we go from here? Um, so I think that it sort of gets down to that like classic writing advice of show don't tell, right? Like the more you can show by the use of specific examples, and our lives are the best specific examples we have, right? Then I mean, there are great quotes that I'm not remembering about the particularity of sharing our own stories and how that opens up to the universal. People go in through the door of our particular experience, and it leads them out to the universal of their own and everyone else's too. So, yeah. We didn't go nearly as long that one. Do you have a follow-up question, Susan?
No, but I'm really intrigued by what you're saying, because the more you talk and kind of suss it out, the more comes into my mind, and I'm like, oh. And then I think the familiarity with one's own story, you think, well, it's not that interesting. Like, but then as you talk about it, you're like, actually, I think kind of that is interesting. So I guess the more air you give it, the more it can, can grow.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. I think, yeah, just accepting the gift of the stories that we've been given as gifts. And so my other memoir that has been shelved, but I do hope that it someday gets published. It's all about my history of child sexual abuse and then the adult mental illness that kind of got triggered by the realization of the abuse and blah, blah, blah. But when all that happened to me, I feel like I'm just like laying on you this whole other layer of like who I am, but it's all right. Don't worry. It's all been processed. It's all fine. But I was hospitalized in the psych ward 12 years ago. And at first I had a lot of fear about talking about that with people, like what's the stigma around that? But I just at some point realized I need to accept this as a gift of this is my story. And this is the way that I'm going to connect with people who need to talk about this, and I'm going to bless people who need to be blessed by this. And, it's like, if I don't talk about this, I'm cutting myself off from the gift of the story.
I have a comment about that particular point in that I also was hospitalized for the same reason you were. My hospitalization was 2007. When was yours?
2011.
Okay. 2011 was when I had my second big manic episode, but we were able to do it at home because we'd already done it before. After my first hospitalization, or my only, I had a choice. I was like, I can pretend, as I've done my whole life, that everything's fine. Well, everything's not fine, and everyone around me knows everything is not fine. Or I can be honest about it and speak about it and write about it later after I became a writer. And I've come to see it as a privilege that not everyone has, but those of us who do, those of us who can, without getting fired or harming people around us for whatever reason. I mean, I know some stories are full of more violence or whatever than mine. And it may carry over into other areas, Susan. Like those of us who have a privilege to be honest and open about our stories, I encourage you to look into that. And like, is this a privilege and gift that you want to enter into? Because there are so many who can't for whatever reason. Maybe they haven't had the therapy to process it and navigate it. And like, they feel completely terrified and unable to speak about it. And that's, our systems, unfortunately, don't give everyone quality medical health care and mental health care. So I see it as a privilege and a gift, and hold it as an honor to be able to write about certain things, knowing that like not everyone has that choice. And it's another sort of like the way I view privilege is, what do I do with my privilege in ways that the common good can be affected in ways to like benefit the common good. I view this like with all of my privileges. So it's kind of just another aspect of that. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that before we start the second session?
No, I agree. And yes, I agree. That's all.
So glad you agree with me. Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop this recording now.